Let's give it a minute, Jeff, and we'll get started.
Awesome.
All right, I'm going to do an intro, Jeff. Let's get started and we'll jump right in. So, thanks everyone for watching. Jeff is, of course, my identical twin brother. He's the author of Middle Matters, a toolkit for middle managers, a fantastic book that I've read a couple times myself. He has a background ranging from his business degree at the Simon School and his work at Kraft Nabisco, Hershey Company, Ahold, and Cracker Barrel. He is a leadership coach and consultant. And Jeff, we're looking forward to today's webinar, which is the goal of leadership, the role of trust in growing your team.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. I'm going to jump right into the slides here and just share a little bit about me for anyone who isn't familiar or hasn't been on one of these webinars in the past. I always like to say this is my bio sheet. So as Eric mentioned, I worked at Nabisco on brands like Oreo cookies. I always say to people that my kid's favorite title I ever had was when I was the director of Twizzlers and Jolly Ranchers. I've worked for Ahold, which is the parent of Stop & Shop grocery chain up in the Northeast, among others, and for Cracker Barrel, the restaurant company. And all of that time, I was in middle management roles, meaning I had people who reported to me and people that I reported to. And so about a year ago, I decided, hey, I want to put down some of the lessons that I've learned into a book. And that is how the Middle Matters Toolkit for Middle Managers came to be. But what I thought I would talk about today is well, actually, what I should say here is in the book, I have a very, what I'll call a very simple framework that really looks at the role of middle managers as three distinct roles. The doer role, which is all about the relationship you have with your boss and building credibility so that your boss trusts you. The leader role, which is all about building capacity with your team. This is the relationship between you and the people that report to you. And influencer, which is all about building commitment between you and the peers and senior leaders that don't report to you and that you don't report to, so that you can get the things done that you need to get done. Today, what I thought I would focus on is that leadership role and how do you leverage that leadership role in order to create more capacity with your team? And in particular, we're going to talk about the role of trust in building that capacity. So I've told this story before, I think, on other webinars, but and it is in the book. But I like to share this story about leadership because I think it really illustrates what leadership really is all about. So a couple years ago, I had on my team the call center, the guest support center of Cracker Barrel, the restaurant company. And there was a woman named Leah who reported to me. And she was the manager of about 12 or so call center employees. And she this was just before the holidays, very busy time in the restaurant world. Just before the holidays, she had stopped by my office to let me know that in the month of January she was going to be heading off on vacation, for an extended vacation for 3 weeks, if it was okay with me. She had saved up all of her vacation time from the previous year, was going to combine it with the vacation time from the current year, because her son, who was deployed in Asia, was going to be home from his deployment. And was it okay if she went away? And I said, yeah, it's fine. I mean, of course, you need to spend time with your family. It's your vacation. Had no issues with her doing this, and frankly, it was going to be in January, which is a relatively quiet time for guest relations and customer support. And of course, what I didn't factor into account was that we would end up having some issues during the holidays that ended up causing us to have thousands, actually, I think it was over 10,000 complaints that had come in. And so by the beginning of January, when Leah was supposed to be heading off on vacation, the team was buried under 10,000 tickets. I think our response time, which was usually about 24 hours to 48 hours, was up to 2 weeks. And so we were kind of in a messy situation. And Leah said, hey, I'm supposed to go out on vacation. Is that okay? I said, go on vacation. It'll be fine. And what was amazing about this situation is that her team handled it great, even though she was away. She was gone, and they were still able to stay on top of things, give me the reports I need. They were very well trained to do the things that they need to do, even when she wasn't there. And for me, this is an excellent story about leadership, because it is really the goal of leadership is really to create a situation where you trust your team to do the work even when you're not there. That's what creates capacity and frees you up to do other things when you are there. And then when you're not there, it means that you now know my team can get done the things that they need to get done. And so when Leah came back from her vacation, she said, how did it go? And I said, I'm not going to pretend it was easy, but your team was great. And to me, it's the sign of a really great leader when your team is able to function at a very high level, even when you're not there. So that is the kind of leadership that I always look for and I always coach for, is how do you get your team to be functioning at a level where they can function well without you, and they don't and they make the right decisions and they do the right things even when you're not there. So this thinking has led me to this statement about the goal of leadership, which is to create the conditions where you can trust the team to make the right decisions when you aren't there. So I should take a step back for a second and talk about trust. Trust, I believe, fundamentally is a two-way street. A lot of times people focus on, I can't get my team to trust me, and that's why they're not doing things the way I want them to do. And so they don't trust me. They don't believe me as a leader. And I always like to turn that around and say, well, do you trust them? Do you trust that they are going to do the things that you need them to do? Because if you want them to trust you, you have to first create that sense that you trust them. They essentially won't trust you if they sense that you are hesitant about their abilities to get things done and so forth. And so the question then becomes, well, what if I don't trust my team? What if I don't believe they can get the things done without my intervention? So a lot of times I say to people, I like to talk about this idea of a radical, atomic, highly effective, extreme ownership mindset. And those words come from these books, Radical Candor, Extreme Ownership, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Atomic Habits, and Carol Dweck's Mindset. But the sum total of all these books and what they really talk about is this idea that any given situation may not be your fault, but it's still your problem, right? You still need to solve it. So you need to take ownership. And so if you don't trust your team, you can look at that situation from the perspective of, oh, it's their fault because they don't know how to do this, or they're not careful, or they don't do the things that they need to do, or they don't understand. And the radical, atomic, highly effective, extreme ownership mindset says, yeah, and that's your problem, not theirs. You have to solve that problem, because in the end of the day, saying these are the things that my people should do is all great, but they're not going to do it unless you take ownership of this problem. So I wanted to share a couple of quotes. The first one is, it's actually a quote that comes from the Navy SEALs, and it says, people do not rise to the occasion, they sink to the level of their training. In other words, if you don't train people to deal with crises, challenges, difficult situations, they will they'll just do whatever they're trained to do. And if they're not trained, they'll just do whatever comes into their heads. So you are responsible for making sure that they are trained to do the things that they need to do, especially in difficult situations, crisis situations, and so forth. And what this means for you as a leader is you have to avoid the desire and the feeling that the best thing for you to do is jump in and take over to help. And I put that help in quotes, because what you really do when you jump in and take over, or you jump in to help, is you are actually taking away the opportunity for those people to learn how to deal with these situations, because what they're learning is you're just going to jump in and help them. So you really have to have this trust fundamentally that they can learn and that they're going to get it. And frankly, you need to sort of think through, how do I create conditions where they're able to learn before it is a crisis, when it is not a disastrous situation where the only solution is now for me to jump in? Because if you always jump in when it's not a crisis, when it is a crisis, they're not going to know what to do. They're not going to know how to handle the situation. The second piece then is this idea that you have to trust that your team will grow in the long run. They may not always get things right in the moment. And so the quote here that I wanted to share is that delegation is a leap of faith. It's not faith that your team will always get it right, because they won't, but that they will make mistakes and learn from them. You have to be willing to trust your team that they are going to grow in the long run. And you have to be willing to recognize that we are all going to make mistakes, but that mistakes are what we learn from. And so again, I'll go back to this point that I made a few minutes ago, which is you have to create the conditions where people are able to try things out, make mistakes, ideally in conditions where it is not essential, life or death situations, because you want them to kind of know what to do. You want them to be trained so that they can handle these situations when they happen in a crisis. Again, back to that point on the previous slide of they're not going to rise to the occasion. They're going to fall to the level of their training. And if the level of their training is not good, then they are not going to trust themselves, and you're not going to trust them to do the right thing. And then you're going to probably intervene, jump in, and things are not going to go as well as you would like. I think the other really important point that plays into this idea of how do you get it so that you trust your team, and therefore they then trust you, is that if you focus on their growth rather than your success, you will end up with both. And what I mean by that is, if you're looking at the situation of, I am trying to train my team so that they can handle crises, I am trying to train my team so that they can do more and more complicated deal with more and more complicated situations and solve more and more complicated problems. If I am focused on that growth, then what will happen is that they will be able to solve and handle those problems. And so you will end up with a success. Whereas if your focus is always on the success, your tendency is going to be to jump in and make sure that everything happens perfectly. And the result of that is your team won't necessarily know what to do. And then everything is limited by your capacity to jump in. And so if the problems start to get beyond your capacity to jump in, there's no one else that's ready to jump in and do it and take over and get it right. So that's what I mean by you have to trust your team that they can learn. And then ultimately, through that learning, will develop the ability to solve the most difficult, challenging problems that are placed in front of them. And then you will feel comfortable that they are, again, trust them, that they are going to get the things done that they need to get done. So before we switch over to talking through some questions, and we'd love to get questions from folks who are viewing, and Eric has some questions that we have queued up from other folks prior to this call, from folks that I've talked to over the last year, is to basically go back to this definition of the goal of leadership. The goal of leadership, again, is to create the conditions where you can trust the team to function at a high level when you are not there. again, this idea that if you first focus on creating the conditions where you trust your team, that you will start building that direction of the two-way street. And the result of that is the team will feel more empowered. They will recognize that you are in it for their growth and not just for getting stuff done and making you look successful. And they will trust you. And you will end up with this very strong relationship where people both not only feel empowered to get things done, but they also are really great at doing it because they have learned along the way. So with that short intro to this topic about trust, I thought I would just go back to this diagram and remind you that the role of the middle manager is really three roles. Again, doer, leader, and influencer. Today we are talking about the leader role, and the goal of the leader is to create capacity with your team. And the headline here is that trust is really the basis and foundation that creates that capacity. So with that, actually, I'll leave it on this slide here. I'm going to we'll open it up for any questions. And Eric, I know there are some questions we've got already queued up. But if folks are watching and have questions, we'd love to take those as well.
Sorry, just looking for the unmute button here. Thanks, Jeff. That was a great discussion. And as you said, there's a bunch of questions that we have queued up, and happy to take other questions in the chat conversation. So, all right. Here's the first question. And actually, I'm going to start with my question. Can you talk about some of the ways that teams fail to thrive, and what are some of the ways that a leader can either head that off or enable improved success?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about really one way that I see teams fail to thrive. And in the book, I know you've read the book. In my book, I talk about this idea of the funnel. If you are looking for a great book on this topic, there's a book called Multipliers by an author named Liz Wiseman that talks about this. But fundamentally, the idea is that think about the world. I'll use Liz Wiseman's approach because it's an easy way to talk about this. Is think about two types of leaders in the world, sort of two buckets of leaders. I realize there's probably more of a spectrum, but there's two buckets of leaders. One type of leader is the type of leader that believes that only I know the right way to do things. And the other one is, I believe my team is capable of, amazing things. And so the focus of that second type of leader, I believe my team is capable of amazing things, is I am going to try and focus all my energy on unlocking the potential of my team. And that's this whole point about I'm going to train them. I'm going to help them grow. I'm going to give them constant, continuous feedback. I'm going to tell them what they're doing great. I'm going to tell them what they need to work on. But I'm going to constantly be doing this from the perspective of I am trying to help my team grow in order to build the capacity and allow my team to be able to get more and more done than anybody ever thought imaginable. That's what Liz Wiseman calls a multiplier. The opposite of the multiplier is what she calls a diminisher. And she has an amazing analogy for the diminisher, which is that a diminisher is a leader that leads their team from the perspective of one brain with many hands. And what that means is, I sometimes call it marionetting. You have a leader who is trying to get everything done by being involved in every decision. And what ultimately happens in that situation, and let's just call it what it is fundamentally a lack of trust that leader has for their team. They lack the trust that their team is going to get it right. And so they feel like they have to intervene. They have to constantly be making the decisions, be involved in everything. And what happens in those situations is that eventually the work, because there's always more work to do than you can possibly handle, is the work starts to grow to the point where you hit the capacity of the leader to make those decisions, because they're just busy all the time being involved in every little thing. And And what I used to say, oh, you reach the capacity of the leader, and that's what causes the problem. But the problem actually comes because you can actually function slightly beyond the capacity of the leader for a little while, right? They can work nights, they can work late, they can work weekends and whatever. But at some point, if you don't deal with the problem, then working nights, working weekends, constant fire drills becomes the norm. And everybody is in this constant state of chaos and trying to keep up and so forth. And the reality is that if you the antidote for this is to trust the team, to believe that they are capable of learning, they are capable of taking on the problems that you, the leader, are taking on. In other words, not one brain with many hands, but many brains with many hands, because now we can get a ton more done. And so that's what I see is probably the most common mode of team challenge that I keep running into in various places, is that there's somebody in the business who is sort of a leader in the business who is sort of determined that they are the only one that can solve these problems, and it causes the team to essentially not be less productive and less effective than they could possibly be.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of, I think, psychological complexity in that problem, right? I think there's a belief that I think a lot of people believe that if they can make themselves indispensable, that it somehow makes it so they can't be fired, or it gives them this sort of, as you've mentioned many times before, the hero of their own story kind of positive reinforcement, etc. I mean, this actually really resonates with me, because I remember one of the hardest working people that I've ever worked with before was a guy who was putting in like 16-hour days or whatever, and he hired some people, and then he just was micromanaging every email that was going out. So it was almost got worse. I mean, it got worse because he had a team than rather than solve it. And I also think there's this question of like this concept of do versus getting things. The goal of leaders has to be to shift from I need to do something versus I have to get things done. And I feel like people have a really tough time making that transition in their careers.
Yeah. Absolutely. I often tell people this story about while I was working in the restaurant industry, and I've never run a restaurant, but I talked to a lot of restaurant operators. And one of the things that is sort of a known thing that happens is when it gets really chaotic in a restaurant, often what happens is that the restaurant manager, the person in charge, jumps on the grill, meaning they start flipping burgers themselves, they start cooking things themselves. And the problem with that is if you jump in to help, then who's in charge? Who's looking at the situation from a big perspective? Nobody is there going, oh, hey, maybe we should start selling things that don't food to people. Like, let's start pushing food that isn't on the grill, or let's change the speed at which we're seating tables so we can try and catch up, or we may have to turn a couple people away so that we can get. But you've suddenly lost all your situational awareness when you start doing just to do. It's the other analogy I like to use is it's not. Nobody would ever say that an air traffic controller is not doing anything just because they're not flying a plane, right? So your job as the leader is actually to be looking at the big picture and deploying resources in the right way, training those resources so that they can function at a high level when you're there, or even when you're not there, so that you don't, that you can avoid these problems in the first place. And that's really what the job of the leader is. And that's why I say the goal of leadership is to create that trust that the team is going to figure it out. And what happens when you do this over time is that the team is much more satisfied. They're much more, they feel much more engaged. They feel like they are growing, and feeling like you're growing is probably the number one thing you can do for a team in order to drive retention. And when you retain people, you keep the people that have actually seen these problems before and go, oh, this isn't a big deal. I can handle this. Because if you're new and you've never seen it before, you're going to make the same old mistakes that everybody else makes in that situation. But if you've seen it before, or you've been trained, or you've done this a million times, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be as hard. And I think that's, there's a sort of a virtuous cycle that happens when you trust your team and you train your team and elevate them so that they can deliver, is that then they feel more engaged, they feel more empowered, and then you keep them, and then you get a more and more empowered team, and they just keep elevating, and you can keep elevating yourself.
So you talk about trust in that direction of the leader trusting their team, but one of the questions that we have queued up here flips that around. What if I'm the leader and I do trust my team, but they don't trust me? Actually, we had, I think, you were telling me a story about a comment someone had made, like, I'm the only one who knows what they're doing, or whatever, like, from the team, coming from the team up or whatever. But so how as a leader, do you get people to trust you if they don't, or if they're reluctant to?
Well, to me, when you have a situation where the leader is saying they trust the team, but the team doesn't seem to trust them back, there's probably something that is kind of underlying that the leader is missing, and it actually is probably that the leader doesn't actually trust the team as much as they say they are trusting the team. But what I would say is, I think fundamentally, trust with your team starts from this basic idea that I, as a leader, am in it for you and your benefit. I recognize that this is not just a transaction where I pay you and you do work. It's that I also have to invest in you, help you grow, and so forth. And so I think what happens when the leader feels like they trust the team, but that the team isn't trusting them, is that fundamentally the leader is coming at the situation from the perspective of, what can my team do for me? As opposed to, what can I do for my team? And I know that sounds backwards, because we're in a world where we are hyper focused and we have to get results. But results will come when you focus on, how do I help my people grow? How do I get them invested in their work and make them feel like there's something in it for them? And that's really what the foundation of trust is in that other direction, is, are you in it for them? Right? Because frankly, that's, the trust that you're seeing from you trusting them, is you believe that they are in it for you. They are going to do what you ask them to do. The question is, are you going to do the thing that often they don't ask you to do, but are you going to do it? Are you going to do the things that they expect from you? That's what trust, I believe, is all about.
But I think there's also like maybe you could comment on the nuance of this, but like, there is this phenomenon where people think they know their job better than their boss, and maybe they actually do know their job better than their boss does, but actually they're missing the bigger picture, that that's not what their boss has been hired to do. And so it's kind of like, well, he doesn't even know how to, fill in some, specific technical skill or whatever. There is this sort of, and I think, I will admit to having this feeling that I knew better than people about me when I was younger. And I've realized over time that that's not necessarily the most productive point of view. But I think it's especially true, people maybe earlier on in their careers see, how do you think about the nuance? And maybe you can kind of answer that from both directions of like, what's the nuanced version of that particular problem?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is that, and I don't know why we don't train people to understand this, is you actually don't. In an ideal world, you as the employee are the expert in your job, and your boss shouldn't know how to do your job better than you.
Right.
Because if your boss is basically always knows how to do their job better than you, and they're going to keep diving in and taking over, and basically you're not doing this great or whatever, then what needs to happen is you need to train that person so that they can do the job better than their boss. But I often tell people, I feel like I could not have written the Middle Matters. I could not have written a book about how to be great in middle management until I had a role where I was managing people that did things that I did not know how to do. Because that was when I stopped trying to manage their work and started trying to lead the people, right? I was trying to lead the folks that worked for me and help them grow and help them solve their problems. And that's what a leader should be doing, as opposed to trying to tell them how to do the work. Because in that particular case, I didn't know. I mean, at one point I had, my team home office facilities reported to me. I don't know anything about HVAC systems. We were having problems with the HVAC system, but they didn't need me to know about HVAC systems. They knew about HVAC systems. What they needed me to know was, how do I navigate this organization? How do I get approvals quickly? How do I get, the people that I need to sign off on things to sign off on things? How do I get the folks that are going to have to help me, clear out part of the building for a couple of weeks? They needed help with the people stuff, not with the job stuff. And so I think, if you get really, really focused on that as a leader, I'm here to help the team accomplish what they need to accomplish by helping them grow and so forth. But as the direct report in that situation, you have to stop looking at your boss from the perspective of, my boss isn't doing anything because they don't do spreadsheets or whatever. No, that's right. Again, I'll go back to the analogy of the air traffic controller is not flying the planes, right? The job of the leader is to make sure the conditions are set so that we can be successful, not to do the work. And the tendency of the boss to jump in to do the work is actually negative. But we don't actually train people, I think, enough at the more sort of individual contributor level to understand what the goal of leadership is. So they don't understand what the job of their leader is, any more than we don't train the leaders to understand what the job is. And because we don't train the individual contributors to understand that, they get frustrated because they look at their boss, oh, he never does anything, or she never does anything, whatever it is. But they are doing a lot. It's just you can't see all the stuff they're doing. And typically these bosses have multiple people reporting to them. They just have a lot of things that they are trying to accomplish. And so you have to have a different perspective of your boss is doing stuff. It's just not the same stuff that you are doing. And that is a good thing, because what you really want is to let them, allow you to become the expert that you need to be.
So, okay. So, and maybe this is just a personal topic of interest, and I'm going to throw it out there, but you made me think of this thing that was going on when I was running a team a few years ago. I had what I used to call a complex team versus maybe a simple team. And what I mean by that was, for example, I had IT and software and data science and lab management and whatever all under me, and I had different people running all of those things. And there were other people who were also at the same senior director, VP level that I was at, that were running teams where effectively everybody who worked for them were doing, say, variations on the same thing, or were, basically running the same function. And I'm just curious your thoughts on, the dichotomy between sort of consistent teams versus complex teams, and how does that play in this dynamic of trust and the dynamic that you were just talking about, with respect to leading teams that are not, where people are not necessarily doing what is your sort of background is in.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I think that in my experience, when you have a leader who is responsible for a team that does something that is consistent, like you described, and they know how to do it, there are a lot of pros when you do that. You can actually have a lot more people working for you if they're all doing the same thing, right? Because you're really sort of focusing on training people in best practices, helping them, sort of implement the right processes and so forth, which is harder to do when you've got this more complex team where everybody's doing something different. So you probably can't have quite as many people reporting to you because you have so many more things that you have to keep in mind. The flip side of that excess capacity that you have is that there's a real danger when you are running a team, particularly a team that does something that you have been grown up doing over years and years, and you know how to do it well. Your instinct to jump in is 10 times stronger. I'll make up 10 times, but whatever. It's just so much stronger because I know how to do this. I know what great looks like. In fact, I was promoted because I did this great. So I want to create a situation where people do it exactly the way I do it. And the challenge is you have to get yourself out of this mode of, I'm going to do that by sort of, again, I think I used the term before, marionetting and making everybody, sort of try and controlling everything that everybody does, and more focus your time on how do I create the conditions where people have learned to think like the way I did, or think in a way that is going to get the results that they need to get. And then I spend time sort of saying, how do we refine all that stuff that I was doing when I was the doer in that situation? I should now have time to think about, how do I innovate? How do I change? How do I make better processes? There's a ton of opportunity there. The flip side in that more complex team is, and I actually, if I would say to anyone, if you get a chance to take on what Eric described as a complex team, I highly recommend it, because it's sort of the opposite situation. You are now in a situation where often you have people reporting to you like I had, where I don't know anything about what you are doing. I don't know anything about your job. And so I'm going to learn from my people. I'm going to spend a lot of time trying to become better and more knowledgeable about the things that my people are doing. But I'm not doing that so that I can intervene and try and take over. I'm doing it so that I can have a conversation with them and understand what the challenges they're facing, so that I can do the things that they need to support them and their teams, right? How do I, understand, I'll use my HVAC, how do I understand enough about a broken HVAC system so that I can represent my team and get the money that they need and whatever? I don't need to know everything about that HVAC system. I just need to understand enough to have that conversation. So there are some real challenges of taking on a complex team where you just don't know all the things that your team is doing, but there's some real benefits to it, because what you're going to spend your time on is making sure everybody is, following strategy, understands the purpose of their work, that they are thinking about themselves and their own growth and how they're going to get better. They are thinking about their teams and how they're going to make their teams grow. And that was what I often found when I had, a more complex team, was I would spend my time talking to my people about their people and about how to get more out of the team and how to get the team to be more satisfied and more engaged and so forth. That's what we were talking about. That's what leaders should be talking about. But when you are on that other side, that more simple team where you actually know how to do all this stuff, you tend to sort of gravitate towards the things that right? I know how to do this. I'm going to tell you how to do it.
So I just in reaction to that, my thought was, well, I wish I had you as my boss back in the day, because what I found with some of the bosses I had that did not, where I was, I was this technology function and I'm reporting to, people who were more laboratory, chemistry, biology, research, type of leaders, was their answer to this question of complex team was to not engage with me, not have one-on-ones, right. Not actually, just basically be like, I don't understand what they're doing. Actually, one boss said, I can't even be bothered to care about what you do. It's boring to me. It's not what I'm trained in. So we can have one-on-ones, but I whatever, they're for you, not for me, whatever. But anyway, but going to that point of one-on-ones and feedback, etc. So let's talk about the sort of nuts and bolts of managing people who either have teams, who are on your teams, who are in some of these scenarios where they may or may not be somebody you like? What does that conversation, that one-on-one, which you've said in the past is your most important meeting of the week,
Yep.
What do those one-on-one conversations look like in these various scenarios that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I was actually just doing a training about one-on-ones earlier this week, and I was talking about just a very simple 3 words that I think are helpful to remember: clarity, coaching, and connection. So I believe that a one-on-one fundamentally is, the purpose of the one-on-one is to create clarity. What is, basically, you're saying, what's the purpose of my work? What are my goals? And do I as the direct report understand what the purpose is and what my goals are? And does my boss, or does the boss, convey the purpose and the goals? And this is how you maintain alignment between what the team is doing and what the broader organization is doing, because you have folks in the middle who are making sure that everybody is aligned on both purpose and goals. Coaching is all about how do I, if I'm the leader, is all about how do I help my team learn, elevate, all this stuff that we were talking about, building those conditions where I trust the team to do the right thing or to make the right decisions even when I'm not there, is all about where are the gaps? Where is it that if I don't trust that my person can, write a great PowerPoint presentation, what I shouldn't be doing is saying, okay, fine, I'm just going to take it over and write it for them. Because what'll happen is the next time there's a presentation needed, right, for obvious reasons, you're going to end up doing it again. So I need to spend some time with my team, my team members, coaching them to write a great PowerPoint presentation. Here's how you do it. Here's what I'm looking for. Here's an example. Maybe here's a template, or, start with this and create something. And then we'll talk about what you didn't get right, what you did get right, where you need to focus your energy. But the goal is how do I get the people that work for me, how do I coach them so that they think like me, even when I'm not there? Because the goal is to get to the point where I ask for, as the leader, I ask for that PowerPoint, and my direct report shows up a couple of days later with a PowerPoint, and I go, oh, this is great. And even better, not only is this great, but it's so great that I'm going to let you present it. I'm not going to present it because you know it better than I do. That's what you're ultimately trying to get to with the coaching part. And then the last piece, I think, is this whole point about connection. Like, trust, if fundamentally, actually, I was in a conversation recently and somebody says there's no trust in economics and in business. Yes, there is. Trust is the fundamental basis of all, economic transactions, right? I trust that if I do X, you're going to do Y, or I trust that the money you're giving me is worth something, or whatever it is. Trust is really baked into all, financial, economic, and business decisions. And so ultimately what that means is trust is fundamentally about human relationships. And you have to have a connection, a human connection, a human relationship with the people that report to you, or that the person that you report to. Because if you don't, then there's very unlikely to be trust. And so it's important to recognize that the people that work for you have good days and bad days, that the people that work for you have families. They may have stresses that are not related to work, and so forth. And so checking in with people, making sure that they feel like you think they are a human being and not just a person or essentially a machine that is there to get stuff done on your behalf. Again, it's all of that point about how do you create this sense with your people that you are in it for them. And that's how you will build trust. And that trust is what creates then the foundation for better work, better results.
So just to get nuance on this question, you talked about, people have good days and bad days. People make mistakes. They need to be trained or whatever. How do you handle the cases when somebody is doing things and they get it wrong? Number one, like, how do you give that feedback? How do you handle the situations where they're doing it wrong and they just don't seem to be getting it right? I mean, if they're not fixing the problem, Like there are cases where
Yeah.
it doesn't, you don't just explain it and it works. Like that, how do you handle that, these long-term complex situations like that?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot because somebody asked me a similar question last week. And I think the answer to this fundamentally is, if you give feedback and the feedback is not landing, as a leader, you're giving feedback and your people are not taking that feedback, it is not working, whatever, is that you actually need to, I think, shift the way you're giving feedback. And I describe this in the book, but it's a great tool that I learned when I was working for Ahold, a grocery store company. They called Plus One. And the way Plus One worked was, if I was trying to evaluate, in this case, it was in grocery stores, if I was trying to evaluate the produce section with the produce manager, instead of me coming in and saying, hey, there's the banana table is a mess and the strawberries have bruises and the whatever it is, I don't do that at all. What I do is I walk in and I say to them, and in that case, you would say to them, can we do a plus one on the produce section? And the way a plus one worked is they would rate the section, the department from, say 0 to 10. So they might say, oh, I give it a 6. And they go, well, why do you give it a 6? And their job, the direct report's job, was to basically say, here's what I think is going well. I think we did a nice job. We had, the shelves were all set up on time. But we weren't as good with, we had a problem with, I don't know, whatever, the sprayers over in, this case. And so we didn't get to the bananas until late, whatever it is. And you make them do the evaluation. And the plus one part of plus one is you say, okay, what would make it, you rated yourself a 6, what would make it a 7? And they would then say, well, it would have been a 7 if I had, anticipated that this was going to problem, or if I had checked, done some preventative maintenance, whatever it is they say. The whole idea of that part of the feedback is to hear, number one, to hear what it is that your direct report, how they are evaluating, right? How are they thinking about this? And number two, to get their mind open to this idea of there are positives and negatives, right? That in any situation, no matter what, nothing's really ever perfect. There's always room for things to be better. There's always room, whether you're a 6 or an 8, there's always room to plus 1. And then what you do is, after you do that, you give that feedback, what you do is, you as the manager then say, well, here's my evaluation, and you do the same thing. And the goal of you doing this is now to help the person that you are doing this evaluation with. You're not evaluating them, you're evaluating the work together. Is when you're doing this evaluation of this work, you are saying, here's what I think about. So for example, you can say, hey, you rated it a 6, I would rate it a 5. I agree with all these things that you said were positive, and the things that you need to work on. But I noticed there's a lot of bruised strawberries out there, and freshness is a strategic goal of the organization right now. So that's really important to focus on. And so that's why I rated it a little bit lower, or whatever. You can bet that in the next week, at least, by the time you come back in and do this again, that those bruised strawberries are not going to be there, because this person is now incorporated that thinking that you've added into their evaluation. You've now added into some new thinking. So to me, when somebody is not doing, back to your question, is when somebody's not taking the feedback and improving, the thing to do is actually take a big step back and say, okay, I need to ask them to evaluate the work. Because it's not, you can just keep getting more annoyed, and you can keep telling them, you're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong. And clearly that's not working. So stop doing that and ask them, tell me because that's what will allow them to know, or allow you to know, what it is that they are missing. What is it that they are not considering? I really need to get into their head and understand their thought process so I can figure out where the gap is.
So, actually, drilling into that brings up another one of the questions is we have here is, what do I do if my team doesn't understand the big picture, the full picture, et cetera? And before you answer, I just want to like acknowledge that that's actually can be a very complex question. It could be that they don't have the technical skills to have the full picture. It could be that the company can't divulge the full picture because of some strategic reason. It could be that they just haven't been around it a long time, et cetera. And I think there's also this sort of phenomenon I see where people don't understand the bigger picture from, just from a leveling perspective of they're thinking too much about either themselves or their team and not trying to look at it in terms of that big picture of how does this team interact with the rest of the organization? What is the role of this team in the larger organization? How does it fit into the corporate goals, et cetera? Like it's a complex thing, and you aren't necessarily going to be able to deliver that understanding, in a half an hour one-on-one meeting. How do you think about that? How do you think about that understanding of the full picture and giving people better understanding of the full picture, particularly in the context of you can't always give people a true, view into the big picture?
Yeah, I mean, and I acknowledge the challenges of the situations that you're talking about. It's not always possible, but people have to understand what they are working towards, or what they're going to do is they will make decisions about what should be done that don't necessarily make any sense. And I'll give a quick example of this. I think I know, Eric, you've heard this story before, but very quick example is I was working at a soup kitchen some years ago, and I used to work on the dishwasher. And one day there were no dishes coming in from the dining room. And so the guy that I worked on the dishwasher with was like, "Oh, I guess we caught up." And I'm like, "Oh, this doesn't make any sense. We have never caught up at this point before." And I walk outside into the dining room, and there's a teenager carrying a folding table across the room. And the reason he's carrying a folding table across the room is because the table where they were scraping dishes is now so stacked high with dishes that he can't put any more dishes on the table. And so he very resourcefully decided to go get another table to put more dishes on. It never dawned on him to bring the dishes into the kitchen and clear off the table and actually get the dishes moving through the system. Now, I always tell people you could sort of look at that and go, maybe that tells you something about the teenage brain. But to me, I actually always thought this actually tells you something about what happens when people don't understand why they're doing what they're doing. And this, if you think about that story and assume that situation happens over and over again across the corporate world every day, all day long, of you have people with great intentions trying to do the best they can, coming up with great solutions to problems that are not the right problem because they do not know that the goal is to get the dishes into the dishwasher, and they're instead like, no, the goal is to scrape the plates and stack them, right? And because they don't see the bigger picture, they don't understand the bigger picture, they are making mistakes essentially, but they are doing it with all the best intentions. And so what we need to do is figure out how to harness those best intentions in the right way. So whenever possible, letting people know what the goal is. This is what we need to accomplish. And this is why we're doing this. And this is why your job and how your job fits into the big picture is probably the best way to deal with that. What's the purpose? The purpose is we don't have enough dishes to feed all, for all the people that are going to come in. So we got to keep dishes moving through the dishwasher. And so your job is to scrape them and get them into the kitchen. And then they understand, right? And they're not going to make the mistake of, oh, I need to, instead of I'm going to go get another table, I can just stop and bring more dishes into the kitchen, would be the solution they come up with. Now, in the situations you were talking about where the, where you can't share something because something's secret or whatever it is, you have to find a way as a leader to do the best you can to give them a sense of, hey, I can't tell you everything, but let me explain to you, this is what ultimately we are working on a larger project. It needs to be solved. It needs to be solved in a way that I can't share with you, but our piece is essential and fits in this way. And this is what, at least the understanding of like when you hand it off to the next person, this is what they need. These are the things that they're going to be looking for. But you have to give people some sense of some sense of a big picture, even if you can't give them the whole big picture, so that they understand what they're doing. Because otherwise what's going to happen is they're going to put their discretionary efforts into things that actually are working against the business, even though they think they're being helpful. Because most people, I fundamentally believe most people show up every day at work wanting to do a good job, wanting to contribute. They want to do a good job. And it's very demoralizing to be constantly told, oh, all these great ideas and things that you're doing are wrong, a waste of time, or bad, or whatever. And instead, we should be looking at them and going, yeah, I appreciate the proactiveness that you're demonstrating by coming up with a solution, but here's the bigger picture. Can you focus that energy in a different way?
So Jeff, this has been very interesting discussion. I'm enjoying it. I just am noting that we are coming up towards the end of the hour. You have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to give you time to wrap up and put any final thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is I just put up on the screen for anybody who's looking for more resources. On the far left there is a QR code that says community, and this is my weekly newsletter, Middle Management Matters. I talk about middle management topics every week. I post. You can find it on LinkedIn. You can also find it on my website, jeffsiegel.com. There's the book. So if you haven't had a chance to read The Middle Matters, The Middle Matters, a toolkit for middle management, I get comments from people all the time who are a little further along in their career saying, this is the book I wish I had 20 years ago. Somebody sent me a note just the other day. This really is a toolkit. It's exactly what we were looking for. And what I hear from folks that are sort of in the middle of it, who have just sort of started out their career in the middle, is I love feeling that I'm not in this alone. I'm not the only one experiencing these things. So they really appreciate that. And then the last QR code on the right there is if anybody's interested in workshops, coaching programs, talking to me directly, having me spend some time with your teams. There's a QR code there that sends you to my website, and you can connect with me that way. Again, the website is jeffsiegel.com. So I'll just, and with that, I'll just say to wrap up, appreciate everybody who's tuned in to this webinar. It is not easy to be in the middle. You have a lot of things pulling you in many, many directions. But if you understand that in the middle, you have these multiple roles, doer, leader, and influencer, then you are better able to develop the skills that you need to be great at each of those roles, as opposed to trying to solve the whole problem all at once. And having those skills will make you a better leader, make happier teams, create more trust, and really help you deliver the results that you're trying to deliver. And with that, I think.
Yeah. So again, thank you, Jeff. I always learn a ton from listening to you. You've obviously have thought about these things in great depth. So thank you so much for your insights. And again, as you said, thanks to everybody who tuned in. And look forward to doing this again, probably next month or the month after. And I'll see you then. I'm sure I will see you later today for twinning strategy.
Yes.
So, yeah. All right. Great, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.